Hello and welcome back to the Cipher Brief virtual studio. I'm Allison Span, joined here today by Dr. Joshua Tallis to talk to us a little bit about the strategic importance of the Arctic. Dr. Tallis, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. With Greenland making headlines once again, we thought it was the perfect time to sort of catch up with you and revisit the bigger picture, which is, of course, the Arctic, something that you're an expert in. And it's a region that's rapidly changing both environmentally and geopolitically. So let's just start with the basics, for the American public. Why should the average American care about what's happening in the Arctic?
The shortest route to that answer is that the United States is an Arctic power. This is something that's sort of widely known and understood in certain parts of the Beltway in Washington, D.C., but it can be easy for some folks to forget that by dint of the U.S. state of Alaska, the United States is one of 8 Arctic nations that ring the Arctic Circle. And that gives us a certain amount of voice and responsibility in Arctic affairs alongside those of allies and partners. Canada most proximately, but a number of allies across the European High North, and of course Russia, which dominates along the Eurasian periphery of the Arctic. So just from a simple domestic geopolitics standpoint, the United States is an Arctic power and needs to act that way. Then there are, of course, a number of other significant global changes that increase the temperature, so to speak, in terms of the level of focus on the Arctic. One, of course, is climate change and the implications of climate change for expanding access and use of alternative maritime supply lines, most prominently the Northern Sea Route, something I think we'll probably talk a bit about. And then something that we've heard a lot in the news lately is access to rare earth minerals and other kinds of critical minerals and resources. And so Canada and Greenland in particular are important stores for mineral wealth and for mining. And there's a significant amount of hydrocarbons, oil, and natural gas that are also present in the Arctic. So for shipping reasons that are becoming more accessible because of climate change, mining and mineral extraction, hydrocarbon extraction, and of course, again, just the American domestic footprint in the Arctic. All of those sort of converge to make the Arctic a more significant topic these days.
And I think you bring up a good point there at the beginning of your answer. I do think, of course, within the Washington, D.C. area, it's well known that the United States is an Arctic power. Domestically elsewhere, I do think it's an oft-forgotten part of the American story. So for the people who are just now seeing the Arctic come back into headlines and they're kind of getting bits and pieces of what's happening, can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, just expand on the answer you just gave about why there is now this renewed interest in the Arctic region?
Sure. So I think it could be valuable, instead of thinking about the Arctic as kind of one broad area that can be difficult for folks to get their heads around, I typically describe the Arctic as at least 3 subregions, and those regions have similarities, but they also have some important differences. The first of those subregions you could call the North Atlantic or the European High North. So this is the area around what we've heard a lot in the news lately, Greenland, but also Norway, Sweden, and Finland. They don't have Arctic coastlines, but they have territory above the Arctic Circle, and then to some extent, Russia. There are a lot of important strategic security concerns for the United States that emanate out of the European High North and the North Atlantic. This is a critical route by which the Russian Northern Sea Fleet can flush ballistic missile submarines and attack submarines down into the North Atlantic. And so there are concerns about both homeland defense for the United States and also the defense of the flow of goods, people, material, perhaps soldiers if necessary, from North America over to Europe in the event of a contingency or crisis between NATO and Russia. On the other side of the world, you've got the North Pacific and the North Pacific Arctic. And so this is sort of that proximate area around Alaska and the other portion of Russia's sort of coastal Arctic holdings. And here we see a lot of the challenges relate to partially mineral and resource extraction, but also this is where the United States has one of the largest concentrations of 5th generation fighters, the F-35s, that are based in Alaska. And they're there in part because of a relatively significant potential air threat from Russian aircraft and bombers operating from the eastern reaches of the Russian country. And lately, we've also seen some partnerships between Russia and China, both in terms of combined air exercises and combined maritime exercises. And then the third sort of subarctic component would be that central and high Arctic. And this is an area that's still predominantly ice covered most parts of the year, but as climate change shrinks the period of time where you've got that dense ice coverage for certain parts of the year, we're starting to see rushes towards resource extraction, move towards greater fishing in that region as fish stocks move. And again, this is the area where we've seen the greatest push on the part of Russia for the expansion of shipping through the Northern Sea Route. This is another really important area for cooperation between Russia and China. China and Russia are the principal parties responsible for most of the Arctic shipping we've seen along the Northern Sea Route. And the last bit that I'd offer on this, kind of critical across all three of those regions, is from the US Homeland Defense standpoint, the shortest pathway for a missile being shot from Russia towards the United States would typically come over the Arctic Circle, right? That's if you draw the Great Circle line between the two countries. And so there's a really important requirement for early warning for air defense capabilities in partnership with Greenland and Denmark and in partnership with Canada as well, in order for the United States to have enough time to identify a potential launch of a ballistic missile or now hypersonic missiles heading towards the mainland United States, and to give us the depth and time in order to respond and react and defend appropriately. And so that air and missile defense kind of extends across all three of those domains.
A lot of good reasons that people should be paying attention to the Arctic region that you just gave there. Let's sort of expand on the climate change factor, since you touched on that a little bit. Obviously, ice melt is happening in the Arctic. How has climate change sort of reshaped the physical and strategic landscape of the Arctic?
So, right, everybody's dealing with climate change, of course, right? What a lot of people don't know is that climate change does not happen uniformly across the globe. There are some parts of the world where warming temperatures accelerate faster than in other parts, and the Arctic is one of those places. The latest research says at least in the Arctic, we're seeing around 3 times the rate of warming as you see in other parts of the world. And that is sort of accelerating compounding factor is having some critical impacts. And I guess you could put them into 2 buckets. On land, the biggest impact that we're seeing is permafrost thaw, right? And so there are parts of the Arctic on land that, whether it's winter or summer, the underlying ground below a certain level never thaws. It's permanently frozen. And that creates a really important bedrock upon which a lot of Arctic infrastructure is built in places like Alaska, in places like northern Norway, certainly in places in Canada, but also in Russia as well. This is sort of a universal challenge. As temperature heats up, particularly in the summer months, that permafrost begins to thaw in ways it hasn't before. And that creates critical infrastructure challenges in the Arctic. And that has implications for national security issues, right? I mean, runways and fuel bunkers and all sorts of things like that, and radar installations can become destabilized. But this is more broadly just an infrastructure challenge in the Arctic, and something that adds expense and additional challenges for pre-existing infrastructure across all Arctic countries. In the maritime domain, the biggest challenge we have is variability in sea ice conditions and shorter periods where we have that multi-year ice. Right. And so the big implication of that in the near term is often seen as a boon, particularly if you're Russia or if you're shipping companies that are looking for shorter routes between particularly China and sort of the Far East and the Indo-Pacific and to markets that are either in North America or Western Europe. And as you get longer periods of time over the summer where there's less dense sea ice, it becomes more feasible to move traffic through that region. But again, we see sort of compounding challenges and these sort of iterative cycles. The more shipping that you have passing through the region, the more sort of soot and carbon that you have emitted. That settles in the atmosphere. Soot settles on ice. It sort of increases the absorption capacity, right? If you've got sort of these black soot sitting on the ice, and so you get increased sea ice melting, which leads to more sea level rise. So the long-term effects of sea ice melt and the increasing uptick in the use of regional traffic along particularly the Northern Sea Route, that creates a vicious cycle where it actually helps accelerate the warming that we're seeing in the Arctic. So twin challenges depending on whether or not you're looking on land or at sea.
The future of national security is here. Introducing the Cipher Brief's NatSec Edge Conference, June 5th through 6th, 2025 in Austin, Texas. Join leaders from intelligence, defense, private industry, and investment as they explore the innovations shaping tomorrow's world. Gain critical insights, connect with top minds, and shape the future of security in an interconnected world. Don't just witness the future, be a part of it. Secure your spot now at natsekedge.com.
As you were saying, there's not only environmental challenges, there are also national security challenges. As this region changes and as the environment changes there, it's opening up, riskier routes for, say China or Russia to come in and start moving, more materials in and out.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case, right? And so I think it's worth thinking about the from the maritime route, sort of again splitting that into binaries, right? So security is an important consideration. It's something I'm going to loop back to at the end. It's also worth acknowledging that a lot of the interest, particularly on the part of Russia, in expanding the use of the Northern Sea Route is because Russia sees that as central to helping to expand the economic viability of its long Siberian Arctic coastline, right? There's lots of critical minerals like we talked about. There's, significant natural gas projects happening up in that part of the country. In order to get those material, the ore, the hydrocarbons out, you need to be able to get ships in. And in order to be able to bring in sort of the heavy mining and infrastructure equipment that you need, a lot of which now comes from China, you again need that sort of ingress and egress route, right? So Russia has, in addition to the sort of security considerations and the challenges that poses for the West, for NATO, for the United States, Russia also has, I think it's fair to say, legitimate economic interest in expanding its use of the Northern Sea Route. And then where it becomes problematic for the United States and for others is in the extent to which Russia tries to exert what we would regard as sort of unfair or illegal control over the Northern Sea Route. From the China standpoint, China has had a longstanding challenge. It's often been referred to as its Malacca dilemma, right? China, as a sort of a consumption and manufacturing powerhouse, doesn't create enough oil and natural gas to sustain its economy. A huge proportion of that comes from the Persian Gulf and travels through a number of choke points, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz or the Straits of Malacca and Singapore, all the way through the South China Sea over to ports on the east coast of China. The United States has a much greater capacity through the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force to control the choke points that China has to flow through in order to keep its economy healthy. So for years now, China has sought to expand and invest in its use of the Northern Sea Route for more strategic, yes, economic, but also political considerations and military considerations to give itself some alternative pathways in the event that we end up, we being the United States, in some side of potential conflict or quarantine or some sort of militarized trade dispute with the Chinese. And then the last bit, of course, is the movement of naval craft, whether that's submarines, whether that's surface craft. Obviously, the extent to which both Russia and China can leverage greater directions of mobility in order to create more challenging problem sets for the United States, NATO, and Western allies and partners, that puts greater onus and challenges on the United States to be able to defend from a greater variety of vectors.
And you've discussed a lot, about China and Russia's interest in the region. And I think that's, largely a big part of why we are seeing this topic in the news so much. In your opinion, are we seeing any signs of collaborations between those countries? We know that they're operating, individually and they have their own interests, but are they collaborating together, in your opinion?
Yes. So the China and Russia are certainly collaborating. We've seen not just in the Arctic, but if you sort of zoom out, right? So I'm a maritime and naval analyst sort of by training. And so certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a significant uptick in the amount of combined bilateral maritime exercises between the Russians and the Chinese. In 2024, we saw some coordinated bomber and strike flights near the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone. So that would be in that North Pacific Arctic arena. A little bit less so on the part of particularly the Chinese presence in the high north and the North Atlantic region, right? So there's that value of thinking about these regions as differentiated from each other to some extent. We see obviously a lot more collaboration between China and Russia in the Arctic, where it's closer to home for China. And then again on that maritime front, right? So in general, the Northern Sea Route has been growing for commercial maritime transit across the route. But the vast majority of that traffic, the vast majority of the countries that are benefiting from it are really mostly Russia and China in bilateral trade between one another. And a lot of that is Russian gas and oil coming out of places like the Yamal Peninsula and docking in China for offloading, and then China shipping that sort of heavy equipment that's necessary in order to help Russia continue to expand its infrastructure. So there is economic collaboration between the two. And that's a lot of what really has kept the Northern Sea Route project moving, as the vast majority of other Western shippers really haven't made use of that route yet. And there's effectively no real containerized commercial traffic that's going through there yet. And then the last bit that I'd mention is the sort of economic front, which is a lot harder to see and measure, but particularly in the aftermath of the Russian renewed attack on Ukraine starting in 2022, and the vast majority of the Western world kind of cut off all significant economic activity with Russia. Russia has had to turn a lot more towards China for financing, in addition to certain kinds of engineering and science and technology expertise, in order to help them continue to reinvest in the economic viability and capacity of the Siberian Arctic. And it's worth noting that that can create some friction between the two, right? I mean, Russia and China, I think, have certainly grown closer over the Arctic over the last 5 or 6 years in particular. But Russia is sensitive to the fact that the Arctic is a strategic Russian domain, and it has always tried to strike a balance with sort of bringing China in on the one hand, but also trying to keep China a little bit distanced on the other hand. And a lot of the more recent dynamics, again, in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, have forced Russia to have to bring China a little bit closer in, particularly economically, than I would suspect Moscow would have originally liked.
Interesting. So there's definitely some collaboration, just not sure how close it is or how close Russia's trying to keep China.
And it varies, again, depending on, yes, militarily, we see a lot of bilateral exchanges. Those are not the most sophisticated exercise one could imagine, but they're building blocks potentially to get in that direction. But yes, economically, there's a much more, Russia's much more the junior partner there, and they recognize and understand that dynamic. And it obviously causes a certain amount of discomfort, I think, in Moscow as a result.
Right. This collaboration, how concerned should the United States be about it?
So the U.S. strategy, at least from the standpoint of the Department of Defense right now and the existing Arctic strategies that we have, is best characterized as monitor and respond, right? And so the Arctic is an important theater. Historically, we have not put it as number one, right? We've had this, since the Obama administration now, this sort of multi-decade effort to try and rebalance to the Asia Pacific. And then, of course, with the rise of the war in Ukraine, this renewed interest and concern over security and stability in Europe. And then, of course, the Middle East, no matter how much the United States tries to extract itself from its focus there, always manages to sort of pull us back. And so for years, we've had a perspective strategically on the Arctic that says we will watch what happens, we will develop the capabilities and the capacity to respond as needed, but it's not a priority theater. I think over time, most Arctic experts expect that will have to change, in part because as the Arctic becomes more accessible, it becomes this sort of central linchpin linking the Indo-Pacific, Asia, Europe. All of that converges over the top of the globe, and it's largely as a result of simply the inaccessibility of the region that we haven't had to think about operating in that space. And I would expect to see that geographic convergence happening at the same time as this political convergence between Russia and China really start to pique people's attention, right? Because certainly independently, Russia has demonstrated, at least in Ukraine, it has some significant challenges in terms of multi-domain operations, right? I would hope that would give Moscow pause in terms of its ability to execute a conflict against NATO. China is a much more sophisticated competitor. Those two together, right, really can create some challenging dilemmas for the United States if we end up in a war in the Indo-Pacific and, China can exert through Russia political leverage and challenges, on a 90-degree axis different up in the Arctic, that really starts to stretch the U.S. capacity thin in order to respond to two crises in two different regions simultaneously.
Do you think the United States needs to have more investment, militarily or otherwise, in this region? And also, where do you see the Arctic evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? And do you see the US becoming more involved?
So in terms of capability, it would depend by domain. Certainly, I think there's a really good argument for air and missile defense and space capabilities, that a more expansive presence in the Arctic, in coordination with and partnership with particularly Canada and Greenland, who have largely been incredibly open to working with us. Greenland, obviously, by, with, and through the support of the Danish government. Right. And a lot of this work is already underway, right? Before the election, Canada had announced significant reinvestment in some fairly, by this point, antiquated infrastructure for missile detection systems in the high Arctic. So that work is ongoing, and that work is really necessary. Certainly, I think also the expansion of airfields to accommodate a greater variety of military aircraft across the Arctic, particularly for expeditionary uses, right? So something that perhaps people don't know who aren't deeply embedded in sort of anti-submarine warfare is that the asset or the capability that's probably your best capability for wide area search for, let's say, a Russian submarine isn't a ship or a submarine, it's an aircraft. It's the P-8 Poseidon aircraft, right? And so the more basing options the United States has for distributing those aircraft across places like Greenland, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, all of which, the UK, all of which already permit basing and operations. But any expansion that we can get that provides us more options and more survivability is good for American security. In the more sort of politically contentious category, I'd argue, is a fairly long-running debate over the need for icebreakers, right? So the United States has really struggled. We've got one heavy and one medium icebreaker. They're both incredibly old as ships go, and we have struggled to recapitalize the U.S. Coast Guard's icebreaking fleet over the years. And that was an issue of strong interest in the first Trump administration. The Biden administration's National Security Council announced something called the Ice Pact to bring more indigenous manufacturing capability to the United States in partnership with a handful of other Arctic countries. And then I think we'd expect, given the focus we've heard lately, that the second Trump administration would be equally focused on icebreakers. And then the other more politically charged question is the need for more enduring U.S. Navy basing in Alaska. So whether that's interest in a deep water port in Nome, or that's interest in facilities that have been shuttered like ADAC, that's a more challenging discussion, right? Because the very nature of naval vessels is that you can move them around without necessarily having to permanently base them in places. But of course, port infrastructure does give you more flexibility and more options, and it's also simultaneously a boon to the local economy in Alaska, right? I mean, it enables more imports and more exports more cheaply and faster. And so I would say from a do we need more capability standpoint, that's one of those that's probably on the more hot button issues, where there's a lot of activity going on right now to assess what's necessary and what's feasible. But all those other areas, the air defense and airfield expansions and satellite downlink locations, and all of that is, there's sort of broad consensus that is important. And a lot of our allies and partners have already moved out on some of those investments.
Definitely a region to watch. You've given us, many reasons why it's so important. Anything else that you want to add that you think it's important that people should know about that I did not cover?
I think we covered a lot of ground, but the only thing I'd reiterate is, with the expansion now of NATO to include Sweden and Finland, the Arctic really is split between either NATO or Russia. And I think historically the expectation on the part of most Arctic watchers is that we wouldn't see a conflict start in the Arctic, but we might see a conflict expand into the Arctic. And I do think that likelihood has increased over the last 5 years. Now that every country in the Arctic is either in NATO or Russia, I still think we might expect that the likelihood of a conflict originating in the Arctic is relatively low, but certainly not zero, and has risen over time. But the possibility of a conflict starting somewhere else, whether it's the Baltic or the Black Sea, now expanding into the Arctic, I think has grown significantly over the last decade.
Wow. Interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us such great insight.
Thanks for having
Appreciate
me.
it.